Okay, folks, so we're on to the last mini lecture of chapter 16. And now, we've done a bunch of this community stuff. We've defined communities. We've talked about how ecologists need to be careful about sort of defining the community in the context of their study and rules they can use to define it. We've talked about ways that we can describe community structure, how we can visualize it. And then we've talked about two specific kinds of community effects: direct, between two species who are interacting with each other, and indirect, which are effects of species A on species B as mediated by direct effects on other species. And the last thing I want to focus on here is the idea that not all interactions are the same strength, and that we have special words for naming certain kinds of organisms that have certain positions within communities. And so this is mostly about interaction strength, and community shapers. Let's call it community shapers, because I don't want to give away all the keywords we're going to talk about here. So I drew some interactions for you in the last mini lecture, right, where we had A having either a negative interaction with B or A having a positive interaction with B. And you can imagine that the effect of A on B isn't always the same size. So you could do an experiment where we have a focal species, species A, and we want to know, we have a focal species, let's call B the focal species here, and we have their interactor, species A, right? And we want to know what impact A has on B. You could do an experiment where you have a community where A is present and A is not present, look at population vital rates of B. Population growth rate, reproduction, some function we're interested in, right? We could look at proxies for fitness, all these things we've talked about in the population chapters. And that effect could either be positive or negative, right? Population growth rates could go up for B or could go down for B. But it also could vary not just in direction but magnitude. So you could have a very weak effect of A on B, or a lot of times people draw this with line thickness, a very strong effect of A on B, right? And not all interactors have the same strength of interaction on a focal species. So you can imagine a third species, species C, that also is maybe a predator of B, but has a much weaker effect, as shown by this thinner line, right? And one of the sort of interesting questions in community ecology that folks like to ask is like, which species really drive community structure, right? We talked about how communities can have different diversities and different compositions. Do some of these species really shape community structure and shape diversity and distribution of species? Do others have less of an effect? And a lot of that has to do with interaction strength, both of indirect and direct interactions, right? And so the last part of this chapter talks about that interaction strength and how this varies, and how, a strong direct effect can then have stronger cascading indirect effects, this kind of thing. So read that and understand it. The other thing it does is gives you a bunch of sort of like buzzwords that can help us describe species that have particularly strong community level effects, right? The first one they mention are foundation species. And there's a cool little plot in your book showing a bird and a tree and some other organism. I can't remember what it was, right? But foundation species, if we compare a small songbird that's migratory with, a towering cypress tree, those species likely have very different strengths of interaction just because of their abundance and their biomass, how much carbon they take up in the ecosystem, right? A small bird can only do so much herbivory, so much, I guess most songbirds aren't herbivores, so much carnivory, right? Whereas a cypress tree has many effects because it's, temporally there very often, has many effects because it's extraordinarily large. It could be extraordinarily abundant, right, in some cases, if we're thinking about sawgrass, for example, in Florida. And so these foundation species have a strong community level effect. When we remove them, they very much change community structure, either the diversity or composition of species that are present, because they are large or abundant, right? Large and abundant. Think of this like hemlock trees. Think of this like sawgrass out west of town, right? It is the most biomass of the community. If we did a rank abundance curve of plants in sawgrass meadows, they look like this, right? They look like sawgrass is hyper abundant and the rest of the things have much lower abundance. Those sawgrass plants are foundation species because they are large and abundant, right? The second one your book talks about are ecosystem engineers. Ecosystem engineers have a strong effect on community structure when they're present or absent because they modify or maintain habitat. The classic ecological example of this are things like beavers, right, who cut down trees and produce beaver ponds, and this creates new habitat. And so if you have an ecosystem that has beavers present, all of these species that rely on the dams created by beavers can persist, and so the diversity is much higher, right? That's the classic example of an ecosystem engineer. But ecosystem engineers don't have to be that dramatic, right? This is a great case because it's very dramatic and everyone knows it. But, we talked about nurse plant effects, for example, right? Where a given plant may shade the soil around it and create a microhabitat that facilitates the germination of other seeds. In that case, that plant is an ecosystem engineer. It is shaping, physically modifying the environment in a way that changes either the diversity or composition of species, community structure. So ecosystem engineers change an environment in a way that impacts community structure, right? The final one is a keystone species. And it turns out this is, your book gives a definition of this, which is a species which has an outsized effect for its biomass, right? So these are species that either are ecosystem engineers, really change the composition either by eating a bunch of other organisms or by really changing physical traits of the environment, especially compared to their biomass, right? These are things that are not hyperabundant but have a very big effect. That's one definition of keystone species, and I think the one we'll stick with, but you should know there's some argument about that, right? Sometimes people call foundation species keystone species. This is a term that is kind of fluffy and has loose edges that is, not always perfectly defined. But for our purpose, keystone species are things that have a large effect on community composition. So large community composition effect and low biomass, right? So these are terms you might really easily tie into a literature reflection, right? I'm sure you guys are observing all kinds of ecosystem engineers, all kinds of foundation species, all kinds of species that could be classified as keystone species as you're out looking at your iNaturalist observations. And, keep this in mind as you're reading those papers, right? I think that really sums up chapter 16. So the big ideas of chapter 16, right? Communities are groups of interacting species in the same place at the same time. When we do ecology at the community scale, we have to do a really good job defining what our community is, and we can do that either via physical traits, like our Whittaker diagram, and say we're looking at a given, range of abiotic traits and all of the organisms that are in it, or we can use biological classification schemes that are based on taxonomy. We're looking at all the trees of South Florida. Or based on guilds and functional groups, we're looking at all of the pollinators of the montane ecosystems in Nevada. Or we can look at it in terms of ecosystem function, right? I mentioned functional groups, but we could look at, for example, all of the nitrogen fixing plants in a given area, right? So after we define our community, then we can describe its composition, made up of what species are there, and we can describe its diversity, made up of the number of species and their evenness, and we can visualize that with species accumulation curves and rank abundance curves. And then we can use those differences in composition to ask about how species may have direct and indirect effects on each other, and how a given species may shape composition in a community. And that's community ecology in a nutshell. If you want to learn more, you can come talk to me. This is the kind of stuff I do in my lab. And I think actually I lied to you. I'm going to do one more case study about community composition and ecosystem engineers, because I have some really fun data to show you from iNaturalist. So strike that, one more mini lecture that I just thought of for chapter 16. Stick with me, it's going to be quick and very cool because it's iNat data. Okay, we'll be right back.